right? Let's see, I'm trying to get my notes. There we go. Now I can see my notes, and hopefully you all should be able to see the first slide, right?
Yeah, it looks good, Peg.
Okay, good. So good morning. I am Peg O'Connor. I'm the director of the Stormwater Permitting Unit. We issue both stormwater construction and stormwater maintenance permits under Chapter 19.1 of DEP's rules. This is the second workshop we've had, as we said. The first was focused on a specific site and the unified stormwater rule and how it applies to construction. Today we're going to go a little bit broader and yet deeper. So we're going to cover more situations than we did initially, and we're going to look at when the permit is actually needed, what are the required elements so that you can actually get a permit, what to look for in the SWIP preparation, and one of the big issues that we've had with HPD is the ownership issues and changes of ownership. So we'll go through that a little bit as well. So we're going to start with permit applicability, and what we're determining in our permit applicability is whether or not a project is a covered development project. In its simplest terms, if you disturb more than 20,000 square feet of soil, or you create 5,000 square feet of new impervious area, a project is considered a covered development project. It requires a stormwater construction permit. Now, there are projects that might be exempt. For instance, a private project that drains directly to a water body would be exempt from this process. Most of the projects are now part of the program, though. So when you look at the limit of disturbance and what is disturbance, this is based on soil disturbance. So it includes the work within the project area and also the work outside of the limits of the property boundary that might also be disturbing soil. So the builder's pavement plan is one that comes up frequently when we're developing, when lots are being developed. The builder's pavement plan means that you have to reconstruct sidewalks, sometimes as far out as 5 feet into the roadway. You're reconstructing sidewalks and curbs. Fairly frequently, that work is done because you're using the sidewalk during construction as a lay down area or staging area. Sometimes contractors use offsite areas as their staging areas. So when an offsite area is being used, that might also be considered part of the project. So if the contractor for this project decides we don't really have enough room in the street here, we want to this property owner and we're going to use this as our staging area, this area now becomes part of the area of disturbance. It doesn't require post-construction practices, and we're going to go into a little more detail on that in a minute, but it will require restoration of the property if they are working off-site and it is part of the disturbed area. What is an impervious area? Impervious cover, and I'm going to read this right from the definition. It means all the impermeable surfaces that cannot effectively infiltrate rainfall, including pavement, concrete, and gravel surfaces that are regularly used as parking that don't effectively infiltrate. Any portion of the site of a covered development project from which impervious cover was removed within 5 years before the SWIP submission to the department is considered pervious. So when we talk about something, and we added that to the definition to keep our definitions parallel with the state definitions, because part of the reason for this rule is that we have to comply with the state MS4 permit, and we have to be at least as stringent as that permit. So to make sure we were at least as stringent as that permit, we had to add that into our impervious cover, and that also ends up impacting the area that we are talking about for creating new impervious area. So the last part of what you have to think about is a larger common plan of development. And we see HPD doing projects where it starts out as one big lot and we're going to break it up or subdivide it into smaller lots. All of those lots are now part of a larger common plan. And when you develop a larger common plan, even though you're doing it in pieces, every one of those pieces, even if they're smaller than the 20,000 square feet, are now subject to the rule. So that's another thing we have to keep in mind. Willets Point is a good example of that, where the area, a big area, is being broken down into several small lots. Every one of those lots, even the ones that are less than 20,000 square feet, will be subject to the rule. And in terms of when you're doing the large scale planning for areas like that, you need to keep that in mind in terms of managing stormwater long term. So what are the requirements that you need to meet to get a permit? So the stormwater construction permit is based on a stormwater pollution prevention plan. We sometimes call it the SWIP. The stormwater pollution prevention plan involves two aspects. The first is erosion sediment control, and the second is long-term stormwater management. Now, this is a water pollution control permit. The program is about water pollution and improving the water quality of the waters in and around the city. So these are the critical elements that we need to address. Erosion sediment control is always required in the SWIP. No matter what you do, you have to address what's going to happen to the stormwater when we're in the middle of construction. Okay, how is it going to be managed in a way that doesn't cause, and I'll just say it plainly, it doesn't cause dirt to get into the sewers and the water bodies. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep everything clean. The water quality and the runoff reduction, these are part of our sizing criteria. And these are what, when we talk about water quality and runoff reduction, we're talking about amounts of managing stormwater long-term. This is the long-term, most frequently called the post-construction requirements. Okay, so they say they're not all these cover development activities listed in table 2.2 of our New York City Stormwater Manual. They're also listed in Appendix B of the New York State General Permit. These activities are things that, as standalone activities, and that's a very important thing to understand. When you're doing these activities as a standalone activity, they don't require a post-construction or long-term stormwater management. And there are a lot of reasons why things end up in this category, but the really important thing to know is that if you're doing something, a project, and one of the activities is on this list, that doesn't mean that you can pull that activity out of your project and look at it separately. The project is the project. If the overall project requires the permit, then all the activities within the project need to be addressed. Okay. The next thing is called, we call it the no net increase requirements. These are requirements that were identified to reduce the impaired, the pollutant loading to impaired water bodies. The impaired water bodies are identified by EPA and DEC as water bodies being impaired for certain pollutants. Those pollutants are identified within our permit and they're within our MS4 permit, and the water bodies are actually identified within the MS4 permit. So it's a static list. The MS4 permit gets updated every 5 years, and every 5 years that list will change. So generally, you can find out if you're in an MS4 area. This only applies in the MS4 area, and you find out if you're in the MS4 area using the online map, municipal separate storm sewer map. And this is a Very, very good tool. But especially, I would say probably especially in Eastern Queens and some areas of Staten Island, the sewer system is changing and growing. So the map is not absolutely accurate. And if you are developing in an area where you think it might be, have a connection. So if you don't have a connection to a combined sewer, then you want to check to see if your area is MS4, even if it's not on the map. The great thing about the map, though, if you are on the map, is it clearly identifies if the area discharges to an impaired water body. It identifies the impaired water body by name, and it tells you what the impairment is for. So in this case, it's Coney Island Creek, and Coney Island Creek is impaired for both floatables, that's trash, and pathogens. And then I'm going to go into the stormwater manual. I'm going to say, what do I need to do extra for my project to address floatables and pathogens? And that's how you're going to identify it. The map in general, even where there is an impaired water body, it will, if it's in the MS4 area, it will tell you which water body that the area discharges to. So that's how you're going to answer some of the questions in these application in our stormwater permitting and tracking system, which we call SWIPs. I'll try not to abbreviate too much because I know SWIP and SWIPs sound almost the same. The last thing we look at is the sewer operations volumes. And we call it VV and QDRR. And those things, those are becoming antiquated terms. The VV should probably be VO, the volume of operation, right? The sewer volume, and QDRR is also being updated. That's the maximum release rate. So these are important things. The site connection proposal process covers these items. So you're saying to yourself, well, why do I have to look at them? Well, in some cases, we have overlaps, and that's how we got the unified stormwater rule, if you remember some of the earlier presentations. And so those volumes might be dealt with in the systems that are addressed in this program. And in different cases, in different ways, you want to know what that volume is, because if you reduce the whole sewer operation volume, the water and sewer operations folks, the people who give you the site connection certification, they want to know that. And that has to come up in their certification. And ultimately, you're going to need a certified site connection to be able to actually get your permit from, as they like to call us, BEPA, or the Stormwater Permitting Unit. So just before you can get a permit, you have to develop a SWIP, a stormwater pollution prevention plan, that has erosion sediment control. If it requires post-construction practices, which are most projects, you have to address the water quality volume and the runoff reduction. Runoff reduction is a volume that is attributed to impervious areas that become impervious, and we have requirements to reduce a minimum volume. But ultimately, we want to reduce as much of the volume as possible from all the areas so that we can improve our hydrologic functioning in the area and also reduce the amount of stormwater actually getting into the system. No net increase, again, that's a pollution control. There are 4 specifically identified pollutants: phosphorus, nitrogen, floatables, and what did I miss? It was just there. Pathogens. So those are the 4 specific pollutants, and how to deal with those is in the manual. And then, of course, the site connection requirements. So those are the things that you need to address in your stormwater pollution prevention plan. That's the plan, the approved plan, that your stormwater construction permit and your stormwater maintenance permit are going to be based on. So the critical thing for a stormwater maintenance permit means that you had the post-construction practices, and you have to select a stormwater management practice. You might see the shorthand SMP. That's what it is, a stormwater management practice. Okay. So the new rule required us to use these hierarchies. One is in the combined sewer service area, one is for the MS4 area. And the hierarchies goal is to establish a specific approach. We want to emphasize the use of vegetative retention. Now, knowing the difference between retention and detention, very, very important. Retention means that either the water is infiltrated, goes away, or it is evapotranspirated. It gets used by plants. And those are the preferred methods because those actually reduce the amount of runoff getting into the system. And those are preferred both in the MS4 and the combined areas. And we try to also maintain, you know, we are always trying for vegetated treatment practices because we also have co-benefits of vegetated treatment practices, cooling, you know, reducing heat island effect and encouraging some modicum of wildlife to birds and whatever to be able to survive. It reduces stress to some level as well. The combined sewer service area is now focused, you know, once you get beyond those retention practices, really, you see detention, which means slowing the water down, holding it back. That's detaining it. And the detention practices become more important on the combined side, and treatment practices become more important on the MS4 side. And the reason that we're looking at those things is that on the combined sewer side, ultimately the water is going to go through a treatment plant before it's released into the ultimate environment. On the MS4 side, that water has to be treated on the site because once it gets into the pipe and it leaves, it is going to be discharged into the environment. So we want to make sure that that water is treated before it gets into the environment. On the combined side, we're trying to reduce the amount of water getting into the pipe at one time, so we reduce the occurrence of combined sewer overflows. What do you need to get to qualify which practices are going to work on your site? So we ask for what is called a constraint analysis at this point. And if you go into, again, if you go into the New York City Stormwater Manual, it goes through each of these item by item in more detail than we're going to look at it right now. So soil, subsurface, and hot spot constraints, these are pretty common. The soil constraint is based primarily on an infiltration test. If your soil cannot move water through the soil profile effectively, the water cannot be infiltrated. And that eliminates that category. So a whole group of practices can't be used because I don't have good infiltration. Subsurface, we're talking about the level of the groundwater or the bedrock. Right now we use 3 feet of separation from groundwater, except in Brooklyn and Queens, we use 4 feet because of the sole source aquifer, and that is a state requirement that in areas where there is a sole source aquifer, you have to have a minimum of 4 feet separation from groundwater. And then finally, the hotspots. Hotspots are land uses where just by the very use of the land, there is potential for pollution. Things like repair shops, gas stations, industrial uses where you might store chemicals outside. You know, the maintenance yards frequently have they have fertilizers, pesticides, paints, all of that type of thing. That might be considered a hotspot area. The other constraints include surface constraints, and these are generally associated with zoning regulations. They require or they require or allow the development of a parking lot might be a requirement. Parking lots sometimes have certain requirements for ingress and egress. You know, if it comes from a one-way street, it has to go this way. If it exits, it has to go that way. So there are a lot of requirements there, including lot line buildings, of course. If you have an as of right as a lot line building, I guess you can't do infiltration there. Then you have to be thinking about your green roofs and practices that can be done on a roof. And then, of course, space. And space is one of those things where we don't always think about it as soon as we should when developing development plans. But the locations of existing structures, utilities, property lines, all of these things have to be put onto the plan, and you have to look at what are all the setbacks to these things. The setbacks, that the general setbacks to infiltration practices are in Appendix C in the city stormwater manual. And if you look in the plumbing code, you'll find additional setbacks there. And you know, and I am well aware that there are other setbacks and requirements that you have to deal with, even when you're dealing with green roofs. I have my fire department setback. I have my mechanicals on the roof. You know, I determine a sustainable roofing zone based on things that have to be on the roof and have to be allowed. And so whether you're doing that on the roof or on the ground, it's something that has to be taken into consideration when you're locating your practices. In the manual, Appendix A has the hierarchy checklists. This is the one for combined sewer. If you mark up this checklist and submit it and say that's your constraints analysis, I'm going to return your report and say, this just tells me what you're telling me when you said you can't do. You really, for the constraints analysis, you have to tell us why you can't do what you can't do. And that goes both in the MS4 area and in the combined sewer service area. Okay. Hey, there we go. All right, so the permitting process itself, you develop your SWIP, and you're going to submit that SWIP through our stormwater permitting and tracking system. The system will allow you to upload. Unfortunately, at the moment, the system has a lot of limitations on it. And for some reason, the single document upload limitation keeps going down. So right now, each single you can upload multiple documents at one time, but each single document has to be less than 20 megabytes. Which means for most of our applicants, they have to break their SWIP up into several pieces. I would beg you to break it up into logical pieces, make it easier to go through. So that's one thing that we have a little bit of an issue with right now. The stormwater maintenance easement is required whenever a private property has post-construction or stormwater management practices. So the stormwater maintenance easement, it gives DEP the right of access to the site. If the site is already owned by the city, technically DEP has the right of access. So then in the pre-construction process, you have to complete the permit initiation form and the form to pull the construction permit. The permit initiation form is completed by the owner or developer of the project. And that includes, for example, designating who the contractor is, and that contractor has to be a person registered in the SWIP system, and who the qualified inspector is. And the qualified inspector has to be a qualified professional in our SWIP system. During active construction, you're going through, you're checking, doing inspections regularly. That qualified inspector has to inspect at least once a week. There's somebody called a trained contractor that works for the contracting company that's responsible for those erosion sediment control practices. They have to inspect every day. and they have to document their inspections for the city. So when they're documenting, they should, anytime that they make repair a practice, if a practice is continually failing, they need to note that, and they should be talking to the qualified inspector, who should be a qualified professional. And between them, they should be thinking about working out, well, why is this continually failing? So you're responsible to constantly update this plan. If you do everything exactly to the letter of what your approved plan says and it fails, it's still a violation. So that's why all these inspections happen. So you keep a continuously monitoring what's going on the site to make sure that they don't fail. The qualified inspector, in addition to erosion sediment control practices, is also responsible for inspecting the installation of the stormwater management practices. For construction closeout, NOT is it's notice of termination. And we use the state's notice of termination to close the permits. Also, if there are long-term management practices, we have a stormwater maintenance permit. And that stormwater maintenance permit requires the owner to do certain things, as well as and you have to file surveys, engineering survey, and a long-term operation and maintenance plan. So post-construction, if it's not an erosion sediment control only project, you will have a stormwater maintenance permit will be issued. Annual certifications are required, and every 5 years that permit has to be renewed. So this is going to be a great page to print out when you get a copy of this presentation. This goes through each phase of the process and what needs to be done and by whom. And they put in the icons so it's easy to identify who is responsible for what. So, and just one thing to consider here, the qualified inspector is designated by the developer. That could be an owner developer or developer, but the qualified inspector is designated and hired technically by that person, reports to that person. The qualified professional is the person who's going to certify the stormwater management practices, most likely a professional engineer if the practices required any type of engineering. The contractor is the person who has a trained contractor who works at their company, and that trained contractor is the one responsible for documenting daily inspections and for documenting that they're following up on any qualified inspector requirements or recommendations. So there are responsibilities for owners, developers, contractor, and the people reporting to them. We are, as Melissa stated earlier, we are in process of developing a number of guidance materials. We hope to publish the SWIP template's been revised to include combined sewage treatment areas. It's been greatly improved. I think the clarity is much better. And for those of you who use your own format, I would encourage you to take a look at the new template and consider using it. We hope to have most people using this template. If everybody's using the same format, it'll make it a lot easier and quicker, hopefully, for the review staff to get through the projects. So we hope that we did a good enough template to make everybody want to use it. Some of the other information, the checklist and the pre-application meeting requests are also going to be, I think they're going to really help people get the right information into the right place. Pre-application meetings we're always very open to. We do try to limit them to a half hour because we have so many requests and we need to keep reviewing projects as well. I think the pre-application meeting request template will help everybody provide clear information so we can give you better feedback. And that's what our hope is there. Okay, the other documents, again, we're beginning to work on those, and we have some time to get there. Like I said, I did want to address ownership changes because this has been an issue with HPD sites. So generally, the sites start out as being owned by HPD, and in some cases, the sites get leased, and in some cases, they actually get transferred to a new owner, and the need is a little bit different for each of those cases. So when we have a lease, when there's a lease in place, technically, if it's owned by HPD, it's owned by the city, and we have right of access, but the preference is, and if I can beg whoever's here from HPD, if we can work in language into the lease that covers us for accessing the site for stormwater management, that would be very helpful. It's just clearer and easier than saying, well, we have a right, we're going to come in. You know, it would be better if we have that all set up in the lease. This is always the case. In this case, it would be HPD. In the case where HPD owns the site, but they have a long-term lease, 99-year lease is what I keep hearing about. Doesn't seem so long-term, I think, to everybody, but it's not forever, is what I'm trying to say. So in those cases, HPD may designate the leasee as the entity responsible for the maintenance, and there's a place to do that in the SWIPs. And so by doing that, the maintenance entity would be the first entity we would reach out to if we wanted to schedule an inspection or if we had an issue at the site. If we didn't get anywhere with that maintenance entity, we would go to the owner. So that's generally the way it works, and that's the way it would work here. And then finally, it's the transfer of ownership. Sites that HPD owns, and they want to transfer ownership. So we've been going through a lot of thoughts and ideas on this, and I understand that certain things need to be in place before ownership may be transferred. So these are the two roles that we have in the SWIPs that get involved in the transfer of ownership. So the owner has to be whoever is the fee owner of the property. Okay, if there's an LLC or a corporation or HDFC, all of these are owner entities. And when one of those is the owner entity, a member of the LLC, a director of the corporation, a director of the HDFC, those have to be the people signing as owner. Or in the case of HPD, HPD has a designated person and email that they use as their owner entity, and that person has to sign. And for projects that are currently held by HPD and are going to change ownership, but they need to go through those steps to get a permit before they can actually transfer ownership, the developer hopefully is the same person as the ultimate owner. So the developer is in the system, and the ownership hopefully will transfer to them. The developer can pull the permit. So we've actually just updated our owner certification to make it more compliant with our own rule and our own laws. And here's the key thing: the owner has to be aware of the proposed development activity, and they have to understand what's going on. That's the limitation of what an owner needs to do. The developer is the person really responsible for the project, for the day-to-day operation of the project, for how it progresses through. So the developer is the person who takes the primary responsibility. So in cases where you have a developer that will become an owner, you know, if that developer signs on as developer and HPD signs on as owner, we can go through the permit, because the permit, the stormwater construction permit, is going to be issued to the developer and the contractor. So we can go into the development, into the construction stage with HPD as the owner, and then ownership can transfer during construction. Okay, we worked very hard on hammering this out, so I hope this is working. I don't think we've done many projects like this yet, but I'm hoping that this really works, because this is what we're thinking about doing, and or how we're trying to approach it at the moment. So I think I'm going to end there, and we can open it up to questions. We have some references after this, and I can stop sharing my screen. Okay. Do we have any questions, or?
Yeah, I've raised my hand. I have a question.
Okay.
I'm very concerned because I hear stories in my office, and this is Tony Piscopi from MAP Architects, it's Magnuson Architectural Planning. If we have several sites, we almost always work on HPD sites where the transfer of ownership does not occur until there's an actual construction loan closing. And what's happened to some sites is that the lenders want to see all the permits ready. You have to be totally permit ready. This is one item on that list. And I think there needs to be a connection between what you're doing, which is I applaud you for many reasons, having history with DEP back in 2010 when stormwater mitigation began, but it has the integration between HPD's problem with their projects is there's usually an HDFC, there's always a developer. And if the banks insist, or the lenders insist on this permit, this one particular permit, not being held over till after the closing, and they want it prior, it's going to cause a quagmire because ownership is not clear. It's always in this transition. It's either in HPD's hands, in an HDFC plan hands, and won't be in the final developer, sponsor, nonprofit often's hands until construction closing. And then they also create a certificate entity. So I think I applaud you for the intent of all this, but I think the discussion between HPD and what occurs with their projects needs to be has to have a really good nexus so that it doesn't delay projects from closing. And because all of that work is for affordable and supportive housing in the city of New York, and it's a very strained population that we're trying to serve, and I just don't want to see there be more reasons to slow down that process when there's such good intentions ahead.
So I hope the process that we've initiated is going to address that, because it allows whoever that developer is to pull that permit and to actually have the construction permit in hand. As long as HPD owns it, there's no maintenance easement required. Okay, so
Yes.
the construction can actually begin. They will have an actual permit in hand to be able to do the closing. And once the property closes, we'll have to go through a process to get a maintenance easement into place.
Got it.
Are you saying though that it has that there's more than one closing involved, like it transfers ownership to a developer and then to an HFD?
No,
HDFC?
In some cases, it's a developer from the onset who's getting a closing with HPD. In some cases, there are, for example, some existing buildings that are going to be major rehabbed and some new sites that are in an HDFC's hands prior to that construction closing when it goes to the final development. I just, as long as that, until there's a final construction loan closing, so long as there is a pathway for that, and those entities that sign on to get that permit don't claim that there's undue risk with this, because ultimately they're just signing as a paper owner. They're not signing on to do the maintenance. as long as they don't push back on, what risk does this mean? I think then you may have outlined a path. I just want to be sure that HPD weighs in on that because they know best what the variety of ownership arrangements are in those properties.
Yeah, and I'll also add that one of the things we're working on right now is being able to make a change of ownership at the point where construction ends and we move into the maintenance permit, because, I mean, we deal with small subdivisions too, as single family lots. And when you're dealing with those, ownership is changing rapidly on who is responsible. So we're working on a process that we'll be able to issue the stormwater maintenance permit to the ultimate owner at that time.
Now, how does that work with the DOB side? Because when we're going through DOB process, the plan examiner might say, well, you're not permit ready until you get through the SWIFT process. And so now it's a chicken egg circuitous and arrangement.
Yeah, so you have to get a SWIP approved, and you have to have your permit in hand to get certain building permits. That's correct. And to get your C of O, you have to have that stormwater maintenance permit in hand.
Yeah.
So
getting to the C of O is great, and someone being responsible, but it's our struggle to get them to a closing with documents and permits ready to construct or renovate.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for the clarification.
What's that?
Thank you for the clarification and your engagement on the topic. I just want to be sure that DOB is equally as versed on this.
Yeah, we've also been meeting with the DOB on several issues, so I'm sure we can add that to our agenda. Are there any other questions,
I have
issues?
One.
Yeah.
I have one. This is Chin Glasgow from RKTB Architects. So we have a situation where we kind of rushed, got all our site connection approvals for 12 small lots in East New York that are infill projects, NIHOP, open door projects for ownership, little buildings. And then we were kind of delayed a bunch of different things, EAS, UDAP project, approvals with the council persons and DOB. And at this point, we're 2 years past limitations of the approval. Is there any recourse for that? Because it seems like at this point, our engineer has said that the new DEP standards would have to be filed met if they were redone. So it's kind of like a big redo.
If you're asking about site connection approvals, I'd have to defer you to our site connection crew, which is sewerinfo@dep.nyc.gov. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, I see a couple of questions in the chat. Can you please walk us through the various inspections required by different parties during CA and closeout? I'm not sure what CA is. Construction administration?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So during construction, we have a qualified inspector that's required to inspect the site at least once a week, once every 7 days. If the area discharges to an impaired water body, and there's a list of those in the DEC general permit for that purpose, or if they're disturbing more than 5 acres at any given time, it requires at least 2 inspections per week, separated by at least 2 days. Okay. So those inspections address, again, both erosion sediment control and stormwater management practices. They should be done by a licensed professional engineer, a registered landscape architect, depending on what the practices are and what they're looking for. If it's erosion sediment control only project, a certified professional in erosion sediment control or New York State certified erosion control specialist can also do the inspection. That's if the project is erosion sediment control only. For the other projects, and again, I would primarily be looking for a licensed engineer if it's a practice that involves more than plant materials and layouts. So you could have somebody who has a 4-hour, what we call the 4-hour certification. That's a DEC certification. And if they have that 4-hour certification and they report directly to the PE who is listed as the qualified inspector in the system, then they may perform the inspection. The PE would co-sign that inspection. And what they look for are in the SWIP itself, all the erosion sediment control practices that are likely to be used are identified. The maintenance for those practices is identified, the locations of those practices are identified, and they're going to go through a checklist to make sure everything is in place and maintained. And sometimes you have different stages and phases, and those are also identified. There's a construction schedule in the SWIP, and that is also something that the qualified inspector is looking at. A trained contractor reports and is employed at the company of a contractor, the contractor who's responsible for those erosion sediment control practices. So if you have a site that has a general contractor and subs, and the general contractor is responsible for those erosion sediment control practices, and the sub is responsible for these erosion sediment control practices, you need 2 trained contractors on the site. Usually the general contractor will be the contractor registered in the SWIPs and listed on the permit, and then he needs his trained contractor to check his practices. And then the subcontractor should have his trained contractor should have their certifications available on the site, and their inspections must also be on the site. The trained contractor looks at day to day how the system is operating and make sure everything is in good repair. If they're having a continuous problem, they should make a note of that. That should be looked at by the qualified inspector, and they should figure out what the problem is. If the qualified inspector identifies a problem, the trained contractor is responsible to make sure and make a note in their documentation to show that that problem was addressed. At closeout, the qualified inspector is going to sign off on final stabilization. The site, there are definitions for what vegetative coverage means at final stabilization, and obviously paved areas are paved and they're at their final pavement. That qualified inspector generally will sign off on that certification. There's another qualified professional. It could be the same person, it could be a different person who would be signing off on the actual installation of the practices. And so at closeout, you're doing a notice of termination, and if you have a SWIP that has both erosion sediment control and long-term practices, you would need both professionals. And in the case of the long-term, going for the maintenance permit, you're going to need an engineering survey showing the location of each practice, inverts in, inverts out. If it's, like I said, if it's buried, if it's underground, you want to have that professional on site before they close the system. Make sure that the system is at the right depth, the right amount of gravel is on the bottom of the system. The pieces of the system have been placed correctly. They put the right amount of gravel around the system. So, they have to have all of that, and that has to be on a survey that gets submitted with the final, with the maintenance permit application and the closing documents. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The expected review timeframe, it's a 45-day time frame. If it's standard practices, if they're if they deviate from the standards, it's up to a 60-day process for a review. So generally, we go through, I would say, at least 3 reviews. We're really trying to work on getting people to cut that down to fewer and fewer. And again, some of these documents and some of these guidance documents that are being developed, that's the goal, to reduce the review time and to make it easier for everyone to go through. So, you know, I've heard, I know there have been projects that have been in this office on and off for over a year. And that is certainly not something we want to happen. We want to get the projects through as quickly as possible. So that's why we're working so hard on developing more outreach and more help. Let's see. I can't really comment on the expedited review process that DOB has or that's being suggested here. I don't know anything about DOB's review process, so I really couldn't comment on that.
The comment was really directed to DEP to look at their process as a modicum for what we might employ at DEP, because many of these projects are very time sensitive when it comes to the closing dates and the process of getting designed to the point where they're approved.
I appreciate it. I couldn't comment on it at this point, though.
I know, and it really relies also on staffing. So I'm not suggesting that you take it on, but it is something to keep in mind because it becomes really critical on those other projects.
Sure.
Hi, Peg. I've got a couple questions. This is Jarrell Vaccaro.
Yeah.
We've spoken before. How are you?
Sure.
Thank you for having this. The templates and the further guidance here that you guys are looking at issuing are going to be very helpful. Look forward to those. To touch on, you touched on the BPP briefly with the sidewalk and pavement repair counting right toward the disturbance. But you'd mentioned the 5-foot repair strip. The pavement is now, it's half the roadway plus 5 feet, which does add a substantial amount. And I just wanted to verify that there hadn't been any change, because it's the milling doesn't typically disturb the soil. It sounded like there may have been a change there, but I'm not certain, and I wanted to see if I could get that verified.
So in New York City, for a number of reasons, the right-of-way milling and paving is considered disturbance, and it is included in the disturbed area. We're still not looking for any post-construction practices in the right-of-ways, but unfortunately, that has to be counted.
Okay, so the pavement will follow. Basically, it'll follow the BPP for both sidewalk area and pavement, regardless of the amount of that pavement. And then I also wanted to touch base on the green roof and the tier 1 that we had been discussing. Several of my projects now are going to be full lot coverage, right, with building roof, which means the only tier 1 practice available to us is green roof. I know there had been some talk about formally updating the guidance, perhaps with specific quantitative requirements. Was there anything further there as far as how much green roof? I know nothing specific. Okay.
No. Basically, again, we're looking at the sustainable roofing zone, the way it's defined in the building code. And what we'd really like to see on the plans is we'd like to see you identify that sustainable roofing zone and then talk about how you're going to use that sustainable roofing zone. Of course, we'd like to see, you know, as much as possible be green. We know there are certain times when you can't do green, and other, you know, there are other things that come into play. So,
Understood.
but
Thank you.
that's the baseline that we would like to see for lot line buildings. We'd like to see a plan showing all the actual mechanicals. Some people have been submitting plans where they're calling out their photovoltaics as mechanicals, but photovoltaics are covered under the sustainable roofing zone. So we don't consider those mechanicals. Those are, you know, those are something, you know, sometimes, you know, there's been a lot of talk also about the ability to some of the cells can be built in conjunction with a green roof. And I certainly know several projects where they're doing it in conjunction with blue roof. So that's something to consider. I know the newer ones are flat. It would be difficult to do. The older style is slanted, and those, I guess, they had developed some test cases where they've done them in conjunction and together with, which might be a really cool idea. We're just past 1 o'clock, I think. So I would guess if we don't have any other questions, do we want to wrap it up?
Thank you, DEP. That was great, super helpful. Thanks to every stakeholder on the call who had good questions as well. If anybody does have other questions, you can let us know and we'll route it to the right people. And finally, if anybody's looking for other type of content and trainings that you think would be helpful around navigating HPD or other city requirements, please do let us know at HPD. We're happy to coordinate this and learn from our sister agencies and others.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Very excited about it.